Good morning. So great to have you here at the end of a live stream, and I have a small studio audience as well. Thank you very much to New Zealand Post for making this feel less like I'm talking to a camera and more like I'm talking to an audience. So today is about giving you a bit of a sense of COP22, which was the Conference of the Parties in Marrakesh. It's the international negotiations on climate change. So what I'm proposing to cover really is kind of four broad areas. A little bit of background on what the COP is, because it was my first COP. I was a complete novice, and so was trying to learn about it as I went, and so I thought it was just a bit useful to share that with others who may not have been there themselves. I want to talk a little bit about momentum and mood, because I think that was a really important feature of what was going on in Marrakesh. A little bit about the negotiations, because they're really important, and that's what people are there for. A bit more about what was happening in the side events, and I'll explain to you what those are in a moment. And then finish up with kind of the impact for New Zealand and what I was seeing from the New Zealand negotiating team. So, there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions, and I think you can do that through the live chat for those of you on live stream, and Dawn and Sam, if you guys have had questions, just wave to me. So, what is the COP? We talk about COP all the time. What actually is it? It is three things, in fact. It is the Conference of the Parties, and it's the 22nd Conference of the Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So the UN Framework on Climate Change was signed back in the 90s, so it's that's why there have been now 22 meetings of it. But it's also the meeting of the parties to the Kyoto Protocol, so the people who signed to the Kyoto Protocol, and it's the 12th meeting. And Marrakesh was the first meeting of the parties who signed up to the Paris Agreement. So that's the kind of official terminology. In real terms, it is where the negotiators from every single country come together to negotiate, because it is really a negotiation, to negotiate how they're going to take forward the agreements that they've already made internationally on how we are going to address climate change. And yeah, I think the other crucial feature is that although it is only for the government negotiators to come together, what has been a really significant movement in the last 2 years is the wider invitation of what they call non-state actors, so businesses, subnational bodies like states and local and regional governments, and NGOs. And so in Marrakesh, they were expecting something like 16,000 people to attend, and in the end, it was more like 26,000. So it gives you a bit of a sense of the scale of what was going on there. And COP22, I guess, was a sort of an important and not important COP for a couple of reasons. It was an important COP because it was the first one after the really historic Paris Agreement. So there was a lot of attention and interest in what could be achieved in this meeting, given it was the first time that people were coming together. What made it a difficult COP was that most of the parties hadn't expected the Paris Agreement to enter into force for 3, 4, 5 years. And so a lot of the groundwork, which had been expected to have 3, 4, 5 years of work to do beforehand, hadn't been achieved because the Paris Agreement was ratified so early. So a lot of the conversation and discussion was actually about how the Paris Agreement get taken forward. So it was a lot in the detail of things which don't have kind of real world effect for those of us who are trying to do this work day to day. I think the other reason it was important was the real necessity to maintain the sense of momentum that had come out of Paris, and a lot of people really focused on how we take action to keep below 2 degrees of warming, and for those countries who are really pushing hard on how we actually keep below 1.5 degrees. And so I think that just gives you a little bit of a sense of the setting. So I was there for both Business New Zealand and the Sustainable Business Council. I was really lucky to be part of the New Zealand delegation, which meant I got to hang out with the negotiators and some of the other observers, and that was really useful. And so some of what I've captured here is a result of those conversations, the negotiations I've sat in, and the side events I went to. So these are my reflections, not necessarily the reflections of the New Zealand delegation, and probably, in fact, definitely not their reflections, but the things which I thought were really important. So I arrived on Thursday night, and it was a day or two after the American election, and it was really clear that this had had a profound effect on the mood at the conference. talking to the New Zealand negotiating team, they talked about the impact that it had for their colleagues and friends in the US delegation, and the sense of what the future might look like for them and might look like for the US position. That there was in the negotiations a sense that the leadership that the US had shown wasn't there, because the US delegation weren't sure that they had the mandate to lead in the way that they had it in Paris. And so the mood was pretty sombre when I first got there, but I think the thing I noticed was it flipped really quickly. I think it took 2 days before we started seeing the kind of sentiment that's reflected here from US business, but that was also coming from other politicians. Francois Hollande was really clear that we were going to keep going. Ban Ki-moon, really clear that we were going to keep going, that the US election was not going to be anything other than a minor speed bump. And I think that kind of really defiant tone was maintained right throughout the rest of the COP, which was really kind of nice to hear. In some of the side events I attended, I also heard really similar sentiments from the likes of the state of California. They were very clear that they are heavily invested in the transition to a low carbon economy, and that they are going to continue to work really hard on going in that direction, and that what happens at the federal level doesn't matter that much to them. And I heard the same from Alberta, who, Alberta and Canada, they've got lots of I think it's shale oil, and they have taken a really long-term view about how they're going to cap the emissions that result from them mining that out, and all of the work that goes with that. So really kind of clear sense in which the momentum is there, and it will continue despite what happens in the States. So that's a bit around the sentiment, around the mood. A little bit about the negotiations, and I've included this picture because if people had talked to me about negotiations, this is not necessarily how I would have pictured it. Vast groups of people spread around square tables, many of them needing to listen into translations, because some of it was in English and some of it was in French. Large numbers of people needing to find a way of having a conversation together. And I think that was probably one of the things that really struck me, is that it is a significant feat to get 197 nation states to agree on anything. And a lot of the jokes that I'd hear around the negotiating team were the hours that they could spend discussing where a comma would go in whatever it was, whatever text they were working on. Some of the negotiating team would come back saying, I've spent today deleting 4 paragraphs. So the sense in which these negotiations for the states is a slow process, and they are genuinely negotiated. And the other thing is that you get various clusters of countries coming together who've got aligned interests, who will work as aligned blocks to try and get to outcomes. I think the other thing that I really noticed, because it was my first COP, is just the extraordinary number of work streams. You've got 3 meetings. Each of them have their own sets of work streams sitting underneath of them, and then they might have a multiple of different tracks that they're discussing. Trying to understand what is being negotiated and what is important and how is an almost impossible task. It's a really Byzantine, confused, if you're looking at it as an observer, set of negotiations. And so it took real work on my part to try and understand the things which were going to be important. I think what was useful about being with the New Zealand delegation is I could get a sense of what they were working on, and what was going to be important for New Zealand. So a lot of focus from the New Zealand team on transparency, which is how you think about measuring, monitoring and reviewing progress of the individual countries. Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which is about how we can do carbon trading, what international markets look like. And there was an increasing focus from New Zealand and leadership around agriculture. I think the other thing that's kind of critical, because I'm not actually going to talk to you very much about what the outcomes of the negotiations were, because it's really difficult to attach them to things which are meaningful for those of us who are doing this work every day. But I think the nature of this COP was always going to be that there was no significant milestone for them to meet. They were starting to discuss how they would take forward the work which had been effectively agreed in Paris. So no significant milestones. The general consensus was that, at least from the New Zealand point of view, and more generally, that the negotiations had made progress and that they had been relatively successful. But there will be more work done in Bonn in 6 months' time. They have a 6-monthly meeting, and I think that's a little bit lower key than the big annual COP. I think the other thing that's my reflection on this as well, which is really interesting, is that the Paris Agreement requires a global stock take to happen every 5 years. And what's really interesting from a business point of view is that that creates a kind of cadence now for negotiations, that every 5th year it's going to be a really big deal because we're all talking about how everybody's doing against the targets, and that will set some tone around whether the ambition needs to be raised or raised faster. But it also has a really important piece for business, because that 5-yearly cycle is not the political cycle. And one of the reflections from the business community there was that in a 5-yearly cycle like that, actually some of the continuity is going to need to be held by non-state actors like business. So how does business continue to hold ambition when you can get, presidencies, prime ministers, parties change during that period of time? And the next of those global stock takes, that will happen in 2023. So if you're ever planning on going to a COP, that will probably be a good one. Also worth noting for us Kiwis that Fiji has the presidency of the next COP. I did get briefly excited about the idea that they might do the COP in Fiji, which is much easier for us to get to, but it looked like the decision was heading towards it being held in Bonn in Germany, and that would be around December next year. So it's just a bit of a sense of what was going on in the negotiations without getting into much of the detail. I spent quite a lot of time, I sat in on negotiations, but I also spent quite a lot of time in the side events. And so one of the real interesting features of a COP is that you have negotiations kind of all going on here, and at the same time, countries, businesses, organisations are all running a whole series of side events, which typically look like media briefings, like conferences, like speeches, like dialogues. All of this kind of activity is kind of happening alongside, and almost in some respects never the twain shall meet, because the negotiators are so busy negotiating and they do long hours that it's the people who are there as observers who get the benefit of the side events. A few really interesting themes, I think, which consistently emerged in those. The first is, and this is acknowledged in the negotiations, but the first is that combining, when you could take all of the nationally determined contributions, these are the targets which each country has committed themselves to under the Paris Agreement. When you put them all together, they are not enough to get us to below 2 degrees of warming. When you add them all up, we get this pathway here, which is more like 2.7 to 3 degrees up to 4. Whereas our current trajectory is, without the NDCs, is 4 to 6. And so a real sense in which that needs to be held in people's minds. Yes, Paris was ambitious, and we've got a lot of countries signed up to it, and it happened early, but those NDCs aren't going to be enough to get us to below 2 degrees, which is the commitment in the Paris Agreement. The second theme, which I got very excited about, is this idea of mid-century strategies. The Paris Agreement recommends that that signatories look at a mid-century strategy. What's their plan for till 2050? And I attended a few sessions where there was talk about mid-century strategies, 2050 pathways, or deep decarbonisation pathways. And those are starting to be announced by countries, in fact. So the US, Mexico and Canada announced theirs at Marrakesh. And I think one of the really exciting things about that is for a business audience, we need an idea about what the pathways are to delivering our NDC. And certainly I know that's what members are talking about here in New Zealand. And Minister Bennett signed up to the 2050 Pathway Platform Partnership, that's a bit of a mouthful, while in Marrakesh. And that is, for me, a really positive sign that the government is committing to preparing a 2050 pathway, and that they're going to do it with the benefit of working with other countries. My next reflection is around the role of business and councils or states. Continuing recognition that businesses showed real leadership. I think I heard it a lot that the role of business and non-state actors in really raising the level of ambition and urgency was one of the key features of getting Paris across the line, and that was absolutely evident here in Marrakesh as well. So recognition that business has a lot of the answers and is creating momentum through investment approaches, innovation, science-based targets, which got a good bit of airtime, and setting carbon prices. And again, this idea that business can play a role in maintaining ambition as governments change during those 5-year cycles. I think one of the other things which was kind of a bit of a moment of insight for me, it makes sense when I say it, but it was kind of that moment of, oh, right, yes, some of it is going to be that simple, is a lot of talk about the fact that electrification is going to be the answer to a lot of the global carbon emissions. So if you think about things like cooking fires and electric vehicles, if we can electrify those with a low or zero carbon intensive electricity generation, then we will be going a really, really long way towards getting to the below 2 degrees target. And I thought actually that's a really simple way of thinking about it. It doesn't hold so true for New Zealand, where we're so, we've got 50% of our emissions are in agriculture, but just that idea that actually electrification is a really big driver of change, and if you can take the carbon out of electricity, we will improve people's lives, and we'll get to our goal. And then the thing I think that made me feel, I think, pleased and maybe a bit relieved is the extent to which things like the Sustainable Development Goals are being discussed as part of this conversation. It's always concerned me that we might look at carbon without looking at the whole ecosystem, and our efforts to reduce carbon might result in a whole bunch of other negative externalities. And so a lot of conversation about the Sustainable Development Goals and how they fit in, a lot of conversation about health and well-being, and connecting what haven't felt like necessarily well-connected ideas to climate change and bringing those to life. And so an example of that is that our minister signed up to Because the Oceans initiative while in Marrakesh. And you wouldn't necessarily think of the oceans first when you're thinking about climate change, but that's starting to come through in the conversation. And then this very busy slide is a list of all of the things that New Zealand either signed up to in Marrakesh or in Paris, but talked about in Marrakesh. And I guess for me, one of my reflections is that the New Zealand negotiating team have a great reputation. When I was talking to people from other countries, they'd say, you know, what we like about the New Zealand delegation is you're really open, it's easy to have a conversation with you. You know, I was reasonably unique in being able to attend the COP as part of the New Zealand delegation. That wasn't necessarily common, so there's kind of recognition that New Zealand do some of these things very well, and there's a bit of a degree of envy. Also, that we are absolutely regarded as leaders in the conversations at the COP around agriculture, fossil fuel reform, and carbon markets. So, and I think what surprised me about that is that's certainly not the dialogue we have back here at home. And you know, and I think someone pointed out to me earlier, there's also the contradiction around the fact that New Zealand earned 3 fossils, which are the awards given out by the Climate Action Network, at Marrakesh. And so I think the nuances of around what leadership looks like in the international climate space is just one that I am musing on more now, because there is so much regard held for New Zealand and how we negotiate there. The Minister Bennett was there, and she attended the high-level segment, which is where the heads of state, foreign ministers and others kind of joined the conference and discussed the things which have been put forward by the work programs. You know, my impression from her is she was feeling like she'd been quite successful. She'd had really good meetings and was feeling pretty happy about how it had gone for New Zealand at the COP. And I think the other thing, she and I had a bit of a conversation about it, is she said, yeah, you know, we are going to have to do some things differently back home. So a real sense in which she's bringing that kind of international perspective and the ambition into how we're thinking about it for New Zealand. So just in terms of the list, I think I can't talk about any of these particularly in detail because, you know, they were coming thick and fast. I've pointed out the 2050 Pathway Platform Partnership. I think that's a really interesting one, and I did say to the Minister, developing that is something that business will be very, very interested and keen to be involved in. The Declaration of Intention on 4% for 1,000 around soil sequestration, really interesting for New Zealand given our agriculture profile, and fossil fuel subsidy reform. You know, we're really regarded as having taken a real leadership line on that, and I saw our climate change ambassador, Mark Sinclair, presented to the WBCSD Low Emission Solutions Conference, really calling for fossil fuel reform. So that's all I was proposing to take you through. I don't want to get us tangled in the detail because it is an incredibly detailed there is a lot of detail that comes out of the COP. So without getting lost in it, just wanted to really share my reflections on the kinds of things which I thought were interesting and really stood out for me as a novice attending a COP. So, so we have one question from our live stream. So we've had a question from Waitemata District Health Board, William, who is asking what is the SBC response, what is the SBC position to the government around Trump's proposal to exit Paris? It's a great question, William, and to be honest, I haven't really thought particularly hard about that yet. I think, look, the messages that I was giving to the Minister there were our members are really focused on climate. We're really keen to continue the momentum and keep going. That we would want to be talking to the Minister in the same way that all of those US businesses are saying, you know, we need to stay on this pathway. Just because there's been a bit of a change in the States, that's not an excuse for us to go slowly. In fact, it's probably a reason for us to ramp up our ambition. Any other questions? No? New Zealand Post in the front row of the audience? Yeah, gosh, that's a really good question. So Dawn has just said, has just asked the question about the fact that, you know, if we're seen as being leaders in the negotiations, how does that fold into commitment, and what opportunity is there for business to help government deliver on those commitments? Yeah, I think it's so part of the answer to that is a little bit of it relies on us actually having an understanding of how the government want to go forward. So part of it is us continuing to encourage them to come up with a plan and a pathway for how we're going to meet our targets. I think the other piece of it is a little bit of that movement we're starting to see from businesses, and Toyota are doing this. They've linked their carbon targets as a business in New Zealand to our New Zealand's NDC. So our target as a country, and so part of it is also about how business can continue to signal to government that we are, you know, we're on board and we're in the same boat, but also how we have the conversations about how that transition is going to happen. You know, a lot of the focus for the New Zealand delegation is around agriculture, and I think, you know, that's a sort of more tricky area for us because so many of our members are, you know, businesses who are kind of service oriented. What is it that we can be doing with our membership to think about how we help make real progress in agriculture, and that is going to rely heavily on the right research being commercialised at the right time and with real speed and pace. So I think there's something in it, just not quite clear what the answer is yet. Yeah, there is. There's a lot to think about in all of this, I think. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. All right, well, thank you very much for watching, for those on live stream. Thank you to my wonderful studio audience today. New Zealand Post, big ups to you for staying in and listening. If anyone has further questions about the COP22 experience, feel free to drop me a line, and I'll respond the best I can, and look forward to talking to you soon. Thank you.